How do we create complex characters? I've been obsessed with this question for years, and not just as a writer, as a teacher too. How do we write three-dimensional characters? As a writer, I spent years trying to understand the key to building my characters, until I met this writer that gave me a clue. Liliana Bodoc, an Argentinian writer. She wrote children's fiction and fantasy literature. She wrote the famous saga about the conquest of America. I think only the first book is translated to English. And a few years ago, she gave this lecture at a fantasy literature festival here in Buenos Aires. And in the Q&A, I asked her this question: how do you manage to create complexity in your characters? I was obsessed with that question, and her answer was incredibly honest, I would say. She said that she perceived herself as a very anti-racist person, but when watching a soccer match, she would find herself screaming some terrible and racist thing to the opposite team. So what happened there? And she said, well, we are already contradictory and complex, so maybe it's not so much about doing things. Maybe complexity is not asking you to add and add as if throwing information onto the page, because besides, a book is a limited space, so you cannot add and add and add information forever.
The idea is to do a massive theater piece.
Probably complexity is not so much about me as an author adding and adding bricks and bricks as if I was building a tower, as if a character were a building. Probably my job is not so much about adding things, but about acknowledging complexity, acknowledging those little contradictions that we as humans already have, and they are so rich and interesting.
You're in the scene, you're not just filming it. You're in the scene.
Maybe my job is not so much about adding and addition. Probably it's more about detecting those spots in my writing where I'm unconsciously flattening the depth we already are. And then I went back to this book, Free Play, Stephen Nachmanovitch. I don't know if you read it. It's a beautiful book about creativity from a very Taoist perspective, I would say. And there's a moment where Nachmanovitch talks about the difference of how we conceive of creativity in the West and how they conceive creativity in the East. Of course, it's a generalization, but it's insightful. He says something like, in the West, we tend to see and think of creativity as a process, this adding and adding process, while in the East, they tend to see creativity as a process of cleaning, of opening up space, which is also related to this idea, this famous idea that a sculptor's job is not so much about adding clay or stones, but about carving the stone and finding that David was already inside the stone. The thing is that this perspective demands of us being more humble and less meritocratic, because there is meritocracy in this idea of authorship and the author being the one responsible for the mastery of the masterpiece. We need to investigate our ideas about creativity, because our creative possibilities are very much conditioned by those ideas. So if the meritocratic, you can do it with hard work framework is at the basis of our process, of our activity, well, sure, we're gonna be trying hard to do it right, because we are gonna consider that the value of our work, our novel, our movie, our play, depends solely or mostly on our great effort. But probably it's not so much about effort, because there's also life happening, chance, luck, destiny. There's a lot about complexity that may have to do with letting go of control. And yes, I'd rather think the piece I'm working on has its own intelligence. A German playwright once said something like, the play is always smarter than the author. And I like that idea. It brings relief to this, again, meritocratic pressure that we impose over ourselves as authors. I really prefer thinking that my characters have their own life, their own will, even their own will, their own intelligence. And I rather not call them my characters. I rather not call my creatures mine, or even call them by my own name, as we started doing with Frankenstein, that, you know, it's a misunderstanding. The monster in the original novel doesn't have a name. Frankenstein is the name of the doctor, the creator, but we started through history, we started calling the monster Frankenstein, as if giving the creature the name of the creator. What does it mean? What does that tell about our way of conceiving creation and creativity and the life of our pieces, of our works of art? Wanting to call your creature by your own name, is that about control? Is that about the attempt to control the meaning? Because as authors, authority, the author is the authority. I find it very dangerous when authors explain very much their works. It's not that I'm also interested in what authors and directors and writers and even actors think about their work and their research. I love listening to interviews or reading journals, diaries, but I don't want the author to explain the piece for me, their work for me. Because as authors, they are confused as authorities.
Get to work!
So when the author explains their work, they don't allow the reader or the viewer to interpret and create their own meanings. And that's what I love about art, that art allows us to understand that experiences have different meanings according to every and each of the participants, each of the people involved in the experience. As a writer, I love those moments when I just can't understand why a character is doing or saying something. And I mean, it's not about being completely random, but for me it's very important to leave room for not knowing. Because when I understand too much what my story is about, or all the whys in my characters' behaviors, well, I'll probably leave no room for the reader or for the viewer to read, to create meaning. And if the reader is not creating, is he or she actually reading? Isn't reading about creating? Is reading just a passive incorporation or receiving of the information that the teller, the narrator, already understood and gave us in a package? Is art just about communication of a message? Or is reading actually a creative experience? I think that's where complexity is actually found, in the reader's mind, in the viewer's brain or experience, not so much on the page or in the screen, on the screen. I mean, of course, the page, the movie, the play will or will not invite the reader and the viewer to find complexity, but then it's about the reader, because experiences mean different things. Again, experiences mean different things for each one of the people involved. A very simplistic movie can be read in a very complex way, or a very complex play can be experienced in a very simplistic way. It all depends on the reader, on the viewer. When we as writers or directors try too hard to deliver the message, to render our message, we start controlling the viewer's reaction, and it's precisely the viewer who brings complexity, meaning new perspectives. Complexity meaning multiplicity of perspectives. That's what is complexity, but the possibility of understanding that an experience has or may have different meanings at the same time. I love it when I show a play or a short story or a movie I'm working on or I've made, and the reader or the viewer brings an interpretation or sees something that I haven't seen or even thought of or couldn't even imagine. I love it when other people bring new meanings to my work.
When are we going to get an audience in here? It's been 17 years.
If I knew exactly what my art meant from the very beginning, why would I make it? I love it when they bring something I haven't seen, but of course it's not just about them bringing information, like if injecting information into my play. It's about me as a creator leaving room for viewers or readers to interpret, to read, to create. You as a creator need to leave room for that. If you spoon-feed the viewer all the answers, you don't leave any room for them to interpret and create meaning. So yes, to the question, how do we create complex characters? My answer would be, we don't. We just don't. Complexity is not something we do, it's just something we find, we discover, we recognize, we acknowledge. So let me ask you, have you ever been surprised by your characters, by your own if you happen to write or direct or even act? Have you ever been surprised by your own characters? Have you ever lost control of them? That's an amazing experience. And if you take it to your real life, to your real, so-called real life, to your daily life, how do you react in daily life when someone you think you know happens to behave in a way that breaks your expectations, that moves away from your script of how they are supposed to behave because you know them? How do you react in those crazy moments? Maybe that's where complexity really lives. Not in your plans, not in your will, not in your intention, but in the moments when we don't understand, both in life and in fiction. If you had experienced these moments of getting surprised by your own work of fiction, or if you happen to have that experience in your daily life, or watching a movie or a play or reading a novel, moments where you got lost and you happen to get in touch with this complexity, this ambiguity, let me know in the comments. I'm very interested. Thanks for listening and see you in the next video.